in a stupid way. In fact, these type of movements have good structural positive incentives that allow them to not do this in a stupid way. Let's name some of these positive exemptions. First, there is a fear of backlash. So let me give you an example. If this happens in, let's say, Brazil, and Bolsonaro comes to crack down on you, or I think there is severe risk of this happening over you, so sending the police and these type of things, you will obviously not do it. Secondly, if you think you will be, if you create extreme harms and extreme problems, you will also not do it. You will actually calculate both these type of things, and if the harms and the risks outweigh the rewards, you're obviously not going to do this. Secondly, and this is connected to the first, you're obviously not stupid. Firstly, in many of these situations, these movements have consultants or pro bono consultants or internal members who are moderates who also say, hey, maybe it's a bad idea if we do this, if this causes harms. But secondly, in many of the cases, the leadership of these type of organizations are also adequate people, right? Because in order for you to move this movement, in order for you to have to do things like organize people, lead people, etc., you need to be fairly competent, right? This is pretty intuitive. But thirdly, you also have, internal accountability mechanisms over yourself, etc. So you're able to, get information. You're able to have a moderate constituency who will call you out if you do this in problematic way. So this is why you'll do it selectively and strategically. We may assume that there could be a challenge from OP as to why exactly you'll be able to do this. Firstly, we think there is black market of existing in many countries around the world. So you'll be able to buy bombs. You'll be able to buy all of these sort of things. You'll be able to learn how to build it or get someone to teach you how to do this. But secondly, you also have kind of a radical wing within these sorts of people. So we think these are the people who will do this in these types of cases. Let's get into the arguments. Why will this cause good arguments in this sort of case? So we think this will be used mainly in two situations. One, when all else has failed. So when you try protests and it simply doesn't happen, when you try to inform the public but they're too corrupt to care, or when there will be very, very good impacts and maybe there will be certain harms, but you'll be able to, the good impacts will be able to outweigh and these type of things. Let me give you an example. When, for example, pipes of a factory flood the water and this causes people to have cancer, this causes the wildlife to die, this basically kills people based upon this sort of thing. Or when factories erode soil so that you're no longer able to use the soil, or when the air is so polluted that it creates cancer and all of these sorts of things, etc. So here I want to get into how exactly why exactly this stopped. And so when we're talking about the most radical things, like for example blowing shit up and doing these type of things that literally stop the operation, we think this either A will stop them in total or B will slow them down because they'll have to rebuild the pipe, have to do this sort of thing. This is good because firstly there is a time lag, and if we're in the process of getting an ecology reform, we're able, in terms of legislation, to stop the pipe or something like that. This time lag is enough of a time to stop irreversible harms from happening, right? So maybe in 2 years we'll be able to get the policy. If for these 2 years there is no pipe that's polluting this sort of thing, we're able to stop irreversible soil erosion. But secondly, deterrence, and this is very important. If these people know, these corporations, that we can blow up their pipe, that we can stop their operations, that we can block their supply chains and all this sort of thing, firstly, this lowers their profit margins. But secondly, they're also afraid that you'll be able to do this again. So when they have to choose the comparative in order to continue their operations, they'll most likely, create internal checks and balances so you don't blow up their pipe, or at least try to do something in order to seem as if they're doing this in a good way, which stops the polluting and this sort of thing. So this is first mechanism. Second mechanism is that you're going to shine information on these type of things. Why otherwise you doing these type of things will information be not shined? Firstly, in many of these cases, these corporations are using the veneer of it's a private property, right? You cannot go in. They own also the land across, so you cannot go and see that this pollution is happening, these sort of things. But secondly, just corruption, right? They're corrupting the government, and that's why they're able to do this. So why are we able through these methods to shine light on this sort of things? Firstly, this will create massive attention towards these types of problems because it will be in the news. People will see the factory blew up, or or there is a huge stop of trucks and these type of things. So this will change. Many people want to view this sort of thing. So let me walk you through the process of what will happen towards the average Joe. Firstly, there will be a shock value to you. You'll go like, why did they blow up a pipe and this sort of thing? So which leads to the second thing, which is curiosity. You'll wonder what exactly is happening. You want to read up a bit more information. You want to choose this sort of thing. Then this, demand of the people will also cater to other parties, media, or other or the environmental organization themselves, trying to see what information is there, trying to pressure to ask questions. So what is happening? This mechanism will also pressure the government, who will also be obliged, to create an investigation, who will send the police. And when the police is investigating, investigating, they'll also be able to see the other things, right? So, for example, all the pollution and this type of things. And because, how do you say, the government is at least to a certain extent accountable, or will be pressured to be accountable, they will talk about this information in this sort of case, which will lead to some kind of action towards these type of companies. Note, the fact that they can corrupt one official doesn't mean that the state, when the whole state realizes this, to stop the whole project in this sort of thing. So you may lead to factory shutdown or more accountability checks and balances on this factory and these type of things. Before I continue to why a third mechanism, yeah, CEO.
Yeah, so your case is fiated on the idea that people will be smart and careful about this, but the climate change is a disparate movement that doesn't have rigid control structures. Please justify your assessment.
It's not fiated. I gave you structural reasons why this is the case. And look, okay, obviously there are cases when there's small minority environmental movement. They will not do it in these sorts of cases. When there is adequate movement, this will happen. We do not have to defend this in all circumstances, right? This is the important part in this debate. Third mechanism, we can also use other methods, like for example, hacking or breaking in and stealing information to reveal to the world what is actually happening in these sorts, to publish documentation, to get people riled up and to get protests in this sort. So we actually do get tangible changes, and these are huge impacts because, how do you say, it influences people's like wars, lung cancer. It's how do you say, it makes the animals survive, so we have food and these type of things, etc. But even if you don't buy this second mechanism, we're able to increase the support for environmental movements. Notice the framing of the average person. Most people are actually pro-environment, but the problem is that what people do is they usually do some things like recycle or do some things like not buying an iPhone or these type of things. They actually don't want to support the movement, like give donations, volunteer, and do this sort of thing, because they don't trust the movement. The stereotype about these movements is that these are some bleeding heart liberals that only complain about this sort of thing, and they're not actually doing something. On our side, they are doing something, or they're doing comparatively more of this sort of thing. So firstly, this, how you say, creates a good connection with them, because most people actually hate it when corporations flood the water. Most people hate it when corporations are doing all these bad things because they feel robbed, because they feel affected. So you actually sticking it to the man, you actually striking this sort of thing increases the positive impact of this sort of thing. But secondly, they also see the tangible impacts. When the state actually does something, when it actually stops the apathy, this increases your, how you say, your good feelings towards this. So you're more likely to donate, more likely to volunteer, which trickles down to all the benefits that these type of movements do. So proud to prop this motion.
All right, I think that speaker and call me Elo. Here.
Hi, can I
the DPM. You're here.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition say we do not have a tipping point on why once people know they'll get engaged with the movement. Then the only thing they say is people don't like violence, therefore they will stop supporting you. Zero tipping point analysis. Most people who support you have spent years of their lives doing this, are incredibly engaged with the movement, have extreme ties, and have already put massive amounts of their time. Even if they don't engage with this one element of the movement, at a point where this is an existential threat on their lives, at a point where they have engaged with this for years at a time, I'm unsure why this is the one thing that is going to make them not support you in this sort of way. And then they accuse us of not having a tipping point analysis. Firstly, on their fault principle that is actually just a practical thing, there are two responses to this. One, note that yes, it is perhaps unjustified to do illegal things, but at the point where the law is twisted by these corporations, it is justified to do it. CG say this, they don't explain why the law is twisted. Why is the law twisted? Because corporations do things like extreme lobbying to ensure that laws never hold them accountable, even if it might be the popular thing for them to be held accountable. Because corporations do things like bribe people who check them out, these sorts of things. Notice, you are not likely to do this in the cases that are not so scandalous. As per Rumen's analysis, you are likely to use this in the case where the law has failed, where other methods have not worked. This is the point where this thing is unjustified, and the only mechanism left is to do the other thing. It might even be the popular justified sort of thing. But secondly, we simply do not care, because they say, oh, there will be some impact, some people will lose their jobs, oil will become expensive. Two weighings on this sort of thing. One, know that we have to blow up, or we have to do this very few times to send the message necessary, because we need to send the message that we are capable of doing this, not to do it all the time. So we can blow up one pipeline, and this does not mean that oil will fall that much, but any future corporations are not likely to be as scandalous in the way they handle their sort of things, because they know that we are capable of doing this sort of thing. So their harms that happen because of the action we take are comparatively lesser than the positive benefits we get because of deterrence. But also, secondly, let's say people lose their jobs. They say, but the harms from environment are not so big. They are so big. You get cancer, you get illnesses, you die. In the worst case, that is climate change. All of humanity dies. And here is the way. Their things are reversible. If you lose your jobs, you can find another. Energy may rise in price. It will also fall again in the future. Once you get cancer, you do not stop getting cancer. You very often die. So this is the most important impact if you're going to judge this simply on the basis of, oh, we get some maybe harmful impact when we do this sort of thing. Secondly, on rebuttal of their optics point. Before I engage with any rebuttal, here is how I want to weigh it out. And actually, no, beforehand. Why do we have a tipping point? They say, oh, creating shock does not prove tipping point. Here's why this does prove tipping point. Because people really, really hate this and are likely to be very engaged with this. Why? Because A, it engages with their lives personally in this sort of way. It's likely to destroy your job if you're a farmer when you figure out this sort of thing. It's likely to destroy your home. Also, secondly, know that the environmental movement has spent years and years and years, and they're likely to continue. We don't say we'll stop doing this, explaining why this is such a bad thing. Like Greta Thunberg coming out and saying, you have no right, or whatever the fuck she said, has spent years explaining to people why this is something turbo important they should care about. The issue is they don't know. So once we do create the shock, once we do get people to understand to some degree why this happens, this is the tipping point of them being opposed to this sort of thing happening within their area, which generates some change, or to them joining the environmental movement, realizing the environmental movement can actually create change. Insofar as they care very much about these sorts of things, they will care that the environmental movement can generate change. On to their optics point. Firstly, the weighing. There's twofold weighing. The first is, even if we lose slightly support, there will always be people who support us. Why? Because environment is an issue that many people understand is extremely important to humanity's survival. So there are always people that are going to make the way off. Even if I don't agree with this one thing, it is the practically good thing to support this sort of movement. This is to say I am uncertain what the tipping point is. Also, secondly, let's say we become total assholes, everybody hates us, we're no longer divas in front of the media. We do not care. They say support is necessary for change.
No reason. Here is why it is not necessarily important to change, because there are many big reasons why environmental policies will be passed anyways, because the state has interest to do this, because corporations want to cut their losses. They say, oh, corporations stop supporting you. Sure, they'll just support this policy otherwise. But you know what remains? Two things. Firstly, we get the change because we destroy these sorts of things. We get the change that Truman outlines within his own speech. Even if we don't get as much policy change, we are not the delta for policy change, but we are the delta for this sort of thing. But also, secondly, we don't just get our people to be binary, oh, I'm going to vote for the pro-environmental policy because it's likely to happen anyways. We get them to be far more engaged, to understand that they can make a difference, to donate far more money that we can use to mitigate the harms of this sort of thing. So simply support is a weird metric to base their entire sort of thing on. But before I go on, actually, Sio.
No, sure. We can get more engagement on like both your side of the house, but how can you guarantee that this engagement is going to be positive as opposed to negative?
Okay, I'm now going to rebut this, but I already outweighed. Even if it's negative, policy is going to get passed anyways. Who gives a shit? We create big sort of change. We deter corporations. You need to prove that the environmental movement is the one and only thing for this sort of thing. 4 reasons on why support is not, 4 pieces of rebuttal for support. Firstly, know that scandalous people do shit environmental movement anyways. Ted Kaczynski would have still bombed stuff. And notice, we would have still been blamed because corporations have the media, because they can blame it on these sorts of things. What is the delta now? We can get these scandalous people and regulate them. Tell them to do this in a good way, not in a scandalous way. To get these sorts of radical people, I said, don't do it without casualties, do it in these particular cases, not in the other particular cases. So if we accept it will be viewed as terrorists, there is incentive for this thing to be pushed anyways, but we get it far better on our side when we can regulate these people. But also, secondly, know that most people are already, how do you say, radical. As per all of the reasons I described, people do think that violence is the only option, because for the years we've spent on driving this sort of narrative, the environment is the worst thing, it is violence upon you, and we have also said the reasonable mechanism to do it, most people are okay with us turning to violence. But thirdly, we can do things like justify it in the media where we have presence. We can say this was the only option, we had no other option in this sort of way, so people won't just be blankly like, oh, violence bad. But fourthly and finally, we will not be so scandalous. Not every case will be blowing up a pipeline. We can do stoppages, we can do vandalisms that not still attract attention, but aren't as universally seen as something terrible. They get only one example, whereas all of the examples outlined in the info slide work for us because they all attract attention, but they aren't all necessarily automatically unpopular within society.
Okay, I think that's speaker and comment yellow. Here.
Should I keep my camera off or on?
I just want to ask, for OO, are you able to hear everyone with our cameras on, or do you prefer if we keep them off?
I think it's just me, so
Yeah, but for you, is it better if they're off? We
yeah,
can
I
keep
think
them
that'll
off.
be great.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
of course,
Cicely,
as long as that's okay with the
thanks.
speakers, yeah,
So camera's off. Okay.
yeah.
Oh, good. Just gonna get quick notes in order. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. A quick note on top half, 2 pieces of framing on where you actually get a tipping point of popular support for these alternative methods of resistance, and broadly 1 case on protecting dignity of oppressed groups at all costs whatsoever. Firstly, I think a quick note on OO. I think they try to tell you why it is unjust to hurt others who had nothing to do with state oppression that is causing climate change. I go ahead and ask OO to engage in a comparative here. If we can prove to you that there are instances where people are hurt and they are able to go ahead and fight back against state oppression, and that is just, why is that not comparatively better? And we're able to engage with that trade-off on maybe some people's gas prices going up, but we can protect these people at all costs. With that in mind, I go ahead and say 1 piece of framing on where you actually get a tipping point for popular support for these methods of resistance. I think the actual instances where this debate takes place at its most efficacious are regions of historical oppression, colonized regions. This looks like, Native American communities on reservations where pipelines are going through them, where nuclear waste is dumped, colonized regions in the world in which, corporations are exploitative and they harm the waters and all these other things. And this looks like South America with like indigenous regions being completely decimated by palm plants and all these other things. What this means is that you actually get a tipping point for popular support for these methods of resistance in these areas where they have access to no other types of recourse, they've tried all other types of recourse, or they know that no other routes of recourse are available to them by the state, by corporations, by the media, by the global sphere in general. So why are expressions of environmentalism in these regions so important here, aka why are these regions in the debate? I go ahead and note this is contingent on the environmental movement and indigenous rights being very, very cohesive and very, very together for several reasons. I think the environmental movement knows that 1, corporations hurt these areas the fucking most. This is literally just true. If you look at, an inner city community versus a community in South America who's been pushed out of their actual fucking homeland in the Amazon because a corporation just wants to cut down palm trees and you have palm oil plants there. This is a much more severe type of harm here. Secondly, corporations get away with harming the environment to the severest degree in the places that are forgotten by the media, that don't have state recourse, that have no ability to fight back against atrocities placed upon them. These are the types of places that the environmental movement just knows occur in this. This is also where the indigenous rights activists coalesce with the environmental movement overall. It's a way for them to say this is connected to a broader sphere. This is connected to something that can help us. And this is the reason why they get recourse through the environmental movement overall. Thirdly, why is this group the most important in the debate? They are genuinely the people who have the most to gain and the most to lose and have no other routes of recourse on all of upbench. Even if you buy, judges, that all of the advocacy OO says is true for, other methods of recourse, state-based recourse, or you should spend more time on lobbying. These groups have no accessibility to this. Their model for the environmental movement is one that completely forgets the most vulnerable group of people. Our model is so much better. So go ahead and go into why that's the case, on our case on protecting dignity of oppressed groups at all costs. So firstly, why are the methods of a status quo insufficient for these groups specifically? 1, complete inaccess to state recourse. If you're like an indigenous tribe in South America who is pushed out of their homeland for farming and everything that is just generally so damaging to the environment, you have no access to state recourse or where you could go to say these are things that are happening and this is why we should be protected here. Secondly, you're not a market for a corporation. There's no reason for a corporation to listen to you overall. All they have in their minds is a cost-benefit analysis. If you fit into the benefit, they're going to disregard you. Thirdly, they can't lobby. If these groups even if these groups wanted to form actor groups that are able to lobby governments or go externally abroad, apply to international human rights organizations to say we are being hurt. Firstly, realize this is status quo. They have already been left behind. There's such a low likelihood on all of our bench that when we just pivot towards more lobbying, they're actually going to be listened to. But secondly, they don't have enough resources to amass enough to actually be able to go on the international stage to get their issues heard. Fourthly, the media does not fucking care. They have a direct incentive to not highlight global state failure. This is literally the people who fund them and the people who give them jobs and the people who give them career stability. They're not going to listen. Secondly, why are these unconventional methods likely to be supported, likely to be done in these groups? I go ahead and know, I think OG misses why the important instances in this debate, the where you actually get a tipping point, the instances in which these people have no other methods, the ways in which this debate actually applies are to these groups specifically. The reason these methods are going to be supported is 1, the connection to community because of a shared oppression by an identifiable oppressor. This is a reason and why they see that this person is being protected by these groups. I am not. We've seen that this has hurt us severely throughout history, or just now, and this is where you've directly been hurt or directly been pushed out. If you see a pipeline being built and you know the state didn't help you in that sense, if you see a pipeline being built and you know historically the state is the one who hurt you and they're not going to stop this now, I think this connection to your community, because you have all shared this, is a reason why you're able to form a critical mass in this sense. But secondly, when we're talking about Indigenous rights, when we're talking about colonized groups, their connection to their homeland is so severe. I think what this means is that in the instance where the environment is being hurt, this is a rallying cry for so many people who feel their direct heritage and their direct culture, their direct physical being as a community, as a people, is being infringed upon. And if they have the ability to fight back, this is a reason why they will. If we validate this form of resistance globally with the environmental movement, and we allow the environmental movement in these certain instances of Indigenous rights to do this, this is where we get the tipping point debate. This is where we win. But thirdly, they've tried everything else. Every other route of recourse just has been tried. Look at the Indigenous rights activists in the states protesting against the pipelines. Look at how they were removed. Look at how they were shot with rubber bullets. Look at all of these things that tell you other routes of recourse are absolutely not available for them. They've tried everything else. But thirdly, why are these methods outlined better than the comparative for these groups? States, corporation reliance, charity, NGOs, they have no control over whether or not they are actually liberated or actually validated in these instances. But we give them as a unique way to preserve their dignity and say, we did fight back, we did do this, and we are a community that is stable. I will take OO before I get into why this debate winning.
To get your full outcomes, you need to prove that you get the change, which I prove was unlikely and maybe even impossible.
Okay, thank you.
Creating a
okay.
new harm.
You're done. Literally, you prove to me why people in big countries and Western developed nations are unlikely to have support for violence or all of these other methods. I prove to you, and we'll do this throughout the extension, why communities who have tried everything fucking else, communities who have been violenced by corporations, communities who have been violated by the state, who have been historically oppressed, have absolutely no other route of recourse. Your entire model forgets them. Your entire model puts them in the same position they have been forever, at the complete expense for states and corporations that will continue to abuse them going into the future. But what are the impacts of these groups actually being able to fight back? I go ahead and say, note one, this is the absolute strongest impact we have. This is dignity to oppressed groups. Even if you buy that OO's efficacy clash, right, that we're actually not going to be able to get change, we give them a method of resistance in which they feel like they're coalescing as a community. These are groups that historically are disadvantaged and do not have the ability to access self-actualization. These are reparations they'll never get through a state. Even if OO's Meg tells you it's better for to do other forms of activism, these are not accessible to these people. We give you the only route of accessibility they have. But also, this is a revolutionary outlook for oppressed groups in general. It only takes one Indigenous community to do this for another to feel like they can fight back too. This is a global, just stratifying call for oppressed groups to just feel like there's methods of resistance available. At the very least, that is a feeling that is worth winning on. That is a feeling of those.
Okay, I think that speaker and common member of OP, you're here.
Hi, would it be okay, with the chair and OO, if just the person currently speaking had their camera on rather than everyone watching? If not, it's okay, but if the chair and OO okay with that, I'd prefer that.
I'm fine with that. Why don't you try that, and then if let's say they can't hear, they can message in the chat or something.
Yeah, 100%. I'm watching the chat because that's where I would prefer POIs. So yeah, if OO can't hear us, or I guess Gov teams because they need to POIs. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we're just going to get into the extension case. There's going to be a lot of implicit weighing between the other teams, and it'll explain how we fit in the round. I want to start by talking about violence and how it interacts with the state. Panel, the fundamental role of the state is to prevent things like violence and injustices occurring. That's why we call states that can't control violence within their borders failed states. What this looks like by the very analysis OG gave about how the state has been captured by capital forces like pipeline companies like Chevron, which are able to control the policies, but also the state responses, you are likely to get a prioritization of capital over lives within most states around the world, meaning that when you pose a threat to a pipeline, is very likely to incentivize significant responses, as that violence is an undermining of both the state's power, but also the interests of the oil companies that fund the state. This immediately engages with CG because I think it's important to note here, panel. This motion is about the movement as a whole. So as OG literally said, it's not everyone doing it all the time, but we can't necessarily fiat, and Gov certainly can't fiat who is doing it and when. So their case is cool when it's Indigenous people who know their interests best, able to carefully considered action in terms of violence. But what we're talking about, panel, is people globally as part of this movement, or not necessarily Indigenous leaders, also undertaking violence. This is important because it's the movement as a whole, and through things like media association, whereby the media is most likely to focus on the actions that are most notable. Like if you have one peaceful protest protests happening, but at the same day, someone else also blows up a pipeline, the media is going to focus on the pipeline because that gets the most clicks and the most views and the most attention, which means, panel, by association, one person doing a violent act is likely to associate with everyone else in the movement. So their actual case on CG is that Indigenous people, as I'm about to explain, are most likely to be presumed actors of violence and suffer the consequences as such. Why is this the case? Any violence, particularly violence against capital and any sort of like industry interest, is likely to respond with severe crackdowns from the state. This looks like, number one, arresting and prosecuting members that actually carry out these acts. This is a significant chill effect because if you are at a protest or you are at any sort of climate action that involves anything as little as graffiti, because that's on the gov side, and you see those people rounded up and arrested, you are likely to be uninterested in showing up to another protest for fear that you yourself will be rounded up by association. This does happen, panel, as we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, where peaceful protesters were just rounded up because they were near people that were violent. I think this looks like, panel, particularly focuses on those that are the most marginalized, whereby a white man throwing a Molotov cocktail gets the peaceful protesting Black woman next to him also arrested. I think this is significantly problematic because it also leads to preemption of violence. From the state, which means that the police will show up preemptively to your peaceful protest. The police will start, as they literally did in Canada, where they brought fucking snipers to overlook a peaceful roadblock. They are going to presume a sense of violence and therefore be more willing to take overreaching steps because they would rather over-arrest people in order to protect the interests of the pipeline companies that fund their re-election campaigns. What does this mean, panel? It means that surviving state violence is a fucking privilege. It is not something that is accessible to everyone, which means when you make violence a key part or a notable part through the media mech I just gave of the environmental movement, you make participating in the environmental movement an act of privilege in itself. This looks like increasing the risk for Indigenous land defenders of participating in things like any sort of climate action where violence is presumed or violence is carried out, because they're the most likely to face violence from police and state forces. It looks like religious minorities in India who are most likely to be associated as like terrorists by the Indian government, and therefore most likely to, even if they weren't literally doing anything, face the most backlash. It looks like Black folks in urbanized areas who are most likely to live near industrial zones and therefore face all the impacts of like cancer and pollution, who by peaceful protests are presumed violent. And when the police are there, you feel uncomfortable there if you're an individual that is persecuted by the police. This means a couple of things. You increase the risk of fighting for change for people of color or for any marginalized community. This means you decrease the likelihood that anyone participates. This chills out anyone who even considered going to a protest when you know that protest is going to be watched over by hundreds of armed police officers or hundreds of armed federal officers. Number three, you lose the voices of the most vulnerable as a result. Why is this a significant problem? Much in the same way that feminism was really fucking problematic for most of the 20th century because it was dominated by rich white women who wanted the vote for rich white women, not for everyone else. It was very problematic in that it excluded the interests of those that are most in need of help. As CG admits, those that are in, for example, rural Indigenous communities in Latin America are the most in need of change. But when you create an environmental movement whereby those that are privileged enough to know that they can probably start graffitiing things and they'll maybe get a slap on the wrist from the police because they are like literally a race that is less likely to be persecuted, they are creating the conditions in which other communities feel less comfortable participating or raising their voices. This means that the interest of the environmental movement will shift towards those that are there and are vocal. So it looks like privileged communities who sure face the impacts of climate change, but maybe not the same impacts as the underrepresented communities. That means the focus of the attention, the advocacy, and the money goes towards the issues of the privilege who feel comfortable showing up to protests, not those that are most in need of help. I think it, number one, looks like immediate harms to those that do choose to show up and are from more marginalized communities that are most likely to face state violence. And therefore, panel, we are principally denying access to a better life to those that are most in need of it. Because when you create an environmental movement that is predicated on exclusive forms of protest, you exclude those that are most in need of help and reduce buy-in from literally the people who need it most, which is those that will actually show up to a protest, those that actually care. And it also leads to exclusion of other important impacts. So this is the second part of my extension here. What this also precludes good actions. Like, for example, panel, the government world is an endless battle against capital. Like, you blow up a pipeline, like one segment of a pipeline out of like a multi-thousand kilometer pipeline, the company doesn't suffer that much because their insurance company pays out, they fix the pipeline, and it's back to normal again. You are fighting an endless uphill battle. On our side, when you do things like cut capital off at the knees by advocating for things like divestment, you are far less likely to make it, number one, profitable or even possible to even build those pipelines. When like Chase Bank or like Harvard divest from capital investments in fossil fuels, they are less able to build those pipelines in the first place. This means they aren't able to continue just bouncing back from the violence that CG claims, because CG isn't able to get any real impact, which engages with OG's idea that like at least we shut down pipelines for a bit. OG.
Again, we don't have to defend this in the most scandalous cases, but taking you at your best, even if your example is about protests, the state can stand sabotagers in the protest who can throw a rock, who will beat the black woman, as you explained. You have zero exclusivity analysis as to why one leads to the other.
Yeah, so it's very hard if you have a movement that has been entirely peaceful and nonviolent for the state to convince the entire world that, they're actually terrorists because they planted like one actor. On your side, they don't even need to do that because all you rely on is the fact that people gravitate towards the most attention-grabbing pieces of information, which is likely to be the acts of violence, and therefore associated with the movement as a whole, which again, as I POI to you, isn't some structured movement where we can like hold the people that do bad things accountable or carry out violence that is either, even if it's justified, not particularly helpful. We are unable to account for them, and therefore the movement as a whole is associated with violence, impacting everything I just said. So just quickly mapping out like the problems. On our side, divestment advocacy is unlikely to be exclusive because when you meet with the Chancellor of Yale to convince them to divest, you're not very likely to get shot or arrested. This makes it far more accessible, but also far more likely to achieve long-term impacts because violence is great in terms of it can be incredibly effective in small particular areas, none of the areas that see like gov teams successfully mech'd. But on their side of the house, they lose the important means and mechanisms where people actually sit down and talk to you because no one wants to talk to a terrorist. On our side, we protect the most vulnerable and allow them to participate in the movement. That's why we win this debate.
All right, I think a speaker and call in the gov web. Here.
Apologies, sorry. Okay, going to respond to a few things from CO and then just kind of go through the debate thematically. The first thing that we get there, like, oh, the state unable to control violence is a failed state, basically stuff. I just don't actually think that people that actually have no recourse through the state, the most marginalized, the most oppressed, have any reason to care about, like, you know, that obligation or fulfilling that principle. Like, I think the people who have like literally suffered from the violence and the oppression of the state have no actual like principled justification for like following the laws of the state themselves. Secondly, there is also recourse for these people. Like, I think people are just willing to take the trade-off of like, maybe I will go to jail. That's a risk I'm willing to take. That's not the same thing as it being like an immoral act to commit a crime. There is just a punishment for that thing. I don't actually know why that's such a big deal for particularly the people that are most likely to do this. Then the idea of like, oh, the people doing this are likely to be, you know, basically like white activists with less to lose. I just don't think this is true at all. Like, I think the people that are likely to do things which are likely to, like, you know, like criminalize them are likely to be people that have no alternatives. Like, that's like most of the like initial neck of our case. Like, the people that have like no state representation, their interests are largely ignored, they have no interest in the media, are actually the people who are most likely, because they have no other forms of recourse to do this. Like, most of GovBench, like GovBench literally agrees on this, that this is like the most likely scenario is the people who have no form of alternative. We actually make out what that looks like, but like, yeah, that is just the most likely. That is like probably, yeah, that is generally just like where this is going. Then, you know, like peaceful protests, but they actually kind of almost concede this on the peaceful protests, basically getting the same treatment on like, oh, snipers being on the roof and these were fucking peaceful protests. They still had the snipers there. They get the same treatment because there is incentive for these corporations to make these people look violent, whether they do it efficaciously or not. The violence is more efficacious and feels better psychologically for people. I don't know why like there's actually any change there. Then I'll actually just go on to the rest of their stuff on criminalization, because I think a lot of basically the whole up bench does this. Like, basically criminalization, first of all, already happens in the status quo. They've basically conceded this already, but like, I don't know why there's such a massive difference. I think this is like, you know, mitigating a lot of this. Secondly, criminalization just doesn't mean a loss in efficacy. Like, I don't know why, like, all of them actually given divestment, you can't do anyway. Like, I think like the idea that like, oh, they're not willing to talk to you for their own analysis, and the POI they already gave on why the movement is desperate presumably means there are more and less violent groups. There is a very radical section and there is the less radical section. Like, I think you can probably just want to talk to the less radical section for the same incentives that most people, like particularly liberal people, have to, like, you know, limit climate change. Also, secondly, in terms of like people, I think generally people recognize the struggle of people and are appalled by it in most cases. Like, I think particularly with this intersects with other movements when they are likely to get oppressed because they're standing up for their rights. I think that probably looks like people being like, that is a really bad thing. Like, particularly noting the worst excesses of climate, environmentally oppressive things happening, which tends to be with like the most vulnerable, like, you know, Indigenous groups. I think that probably just looks like them being appalled by this and being like having some degree of sympathy and likely some degree of like change. Secondly, anger breeds a sense of injustice, right? I think if you see like, you know, your brother being arrested for doing something that you think is completely justified for them to do, even if you didn't care in the first place, the fact that they got unjustly treated for that action probably means that you very much feel like, you know, I should care about this as well, because you feel it was unjust how they treated. So you have a degree of sympathy. So you take up the cause for them or continue to care. I think that increases the amount of like movement, particularly for like people that have a history of being oppressed anyway, which are the people that matter the most in this debate. And then like, yeah, thirdly, I think people recognize the intensity of sacrifice. Like, I think if someone is willing to do something which is literally like, you know, threatening their life for their own safety, they probably recognize it's something that matters. That probably means that people are just more likely to care at that point. Then the idea of losing support. I think that actually most of where people are talking about this are in wealthy areas that we're willing to take. I think the place where you actually don't lose support are the people that do know, like, you know, the media lie about them, that there is a history of the police oppressing them, that the state are likely to do shitty things, that people that understand that anyway. I think they're the people that are likely to just care. I think that looks like, you know, maybe Indigenous groups or oppressed people that didn't care as much about climate change before, but now recognize the struggle because it's being taken up as well by an environmental group and taking up, you know, an increased degree of support. I think that probably means that they are actually more likely to support. I think that's more important for stopping the most, like, basically bad harms. I'll take the POI from O.
The problem you've still yet to deal with is the fact that you definitely and immediately create a new harm upon individuals who you claim are important with no clear pathway to solving that harm on your side.
This is not a new harm. Like, the idea that people being criminalized, like marginalized groups, Indigenous people who get that anyway for 1,000 other reasons, because of like structural racism, because of the fact that they're already like, you know, fighting other fights to do with oppression from the government. Like, I don't know how this is actually a new harm for them. Like, this is just, you know, the same fight on a different front. I think support then, yeah, basically we support you, you support us. I think you're just more likely to get a critical mass of like, you know, either like left-wing groups or Indigenous support groups or like marginalized groups in countries actually caring about the environmental movement at the point at which you're actually willing to, you know, show teeth, at the point at which you're actually doing things that make a material difference to their life. I think they're just so much more likely to, you know, do coalition building, do information sharing with you. I think that's like really, really useful for literally doing things like, I think their best case is basically people get some change, because like denying climate stuff in factories that do like bad is like a marginal change. I think what we do is actually like mech out where this likely happens, like why that's uniquely so important. Thirdly, why that actually gives people like a large degree of catharsis, why that actually is psychologically important. And fourthly, like I actually think it makes like the structural reasons why this makes it far harder to fuck over the oppressed. At the point at which you have a large degree of people that are buying into the movement, the people that believe like this is a useful thing, I think like structurally long term, you're just less likely to get fucked per the analysis on closing government rather than one instance of change. I also think that deals with a lot of the opposition pushback that we get on this. That's basically saying like, oh no, they always have all of the advantage. At the point at which, you know, the basically the like, you know, like oil lobby is just more scared of you, I think that's an absolutely massive benefit that you're only getting on our side. I think that means that there's like a long-term change that we're willing to get. I also think in terms of information and awareness, I think we're weighing against them because we're getting the most important information to like, you know, the most vulnerable group rather than just generically to the media. I also think we've proven quite support to the most vulnerable. We affect the most vulnerable actor uniquely in this debate. We also get, you know, the largest structural change and realistically how this is going to happen. This is absolutely principally justified and morally the correct thing to do, utilitarianly better for all those reasons proposed.
All right, I think that speaker and call me output here.
All right, I'm assuming I can be heard.
Yep, you can.
Okay. I will take POIs in chat, please. I will count you down before I start my speech, and please give me a couple seconds to gather my thoughts here. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel one point of general response to both government teams. The biggest challenge facing the climate change movement today, or like the environmental movement, is not popularity. So any case they tried to give us about like how you're going to get more engagement and more popularity, and I was going to have like shock, like particularly from OG, but like a little bit from CG, is significantly already like out of this debate because they don't prove the comparative as to why it even needs that kind of popularity in the first place. I'm going to get into extraneous response to CG first, really like rebuilding against Locke, and then responses to OG, and then weighing out against every team as well. Coming to closing government, right? I think their biggest case stands directly clash with ours, which is the idea that, okay, Indigenous and marginalized groups will be the ones who will largely take this action. That's what they say. But Locke directly tells you that these are the people who are unlikely to be the ones who actually participate in violence, but also additionally, then become very, very unlikely to participate in any form of climate change action, go to protests, or like associate with the movement in any way, specifically because of like fear of like state response. Cool. Why do we already been out against closing government on this clash? Closing government does not give you a single reason why these actors are likely to be the ones, until the whip speech, by the way, in the extension, they give you 0 reasons as why these actors are likely to be the ones who take violent action. We have incentives to see why these actors take some action, not necessarily violent ones. Here are a couple of reasons why they don't take violent actions, as Lachlan already mentioned. Lachlan told you that the biggest fear then is a response from the state. You have a threat of a response from a state every time you take some form of violent action, and that in and of itself becomes the biggest like reason for you to not take action, as OG's mech was basically, okay, if you're going to like fear significant backlash, you're not going to do this. On our side of the house, these groups are the one that face the most significant backlash to any form of violent action, even if carefully considered. B, note, you're also then automatically isolated from all other forms of action as a response of this, and you probably don't want to do that. So insofar as that is the case, you are not, Indigenous groups are unlikely to be the ones to take these violent actions. Secondly, they don't have the necessary resources, right? These are probably the most weakest resource like rich groups within the entire movement as abroad, because funding largely comes from like urban centers and like privileged individuals or privileged leaders within the group. You get funding for like that kind of like, you know, the very popular leaders of the group, and not for like fringe level local leaders. And insofar as that is the case, we don't know why you have the resources to like conduct violent attacks and somehow evade state response. C, the idea that, okay, you also have bigger concerns as Indigenous groups that I think CG just completely discounts, right? I think there's bigger issues facing you than climate change. You in fact have bigger beef with the state because your biggest problem is like the state has historically been the one conducting violence against you or oppressing you, and you have a significantly larger issue and a bone to pick with the state as a whole, which is causing more problems in your day-to-day life, like for example, denying you like access to your lands or like clean service as a opposed to like broader climate change and how that impacts you. So insofar as you have bigger issues and you have not chosen violence in those issues, we don't understand why you're likely to choose violence for like issues of climate change when the impacts, yes, are disproportionately felt by Indigenous or like marginalized groups or the global south, but again, at the same time, not as serious as the impacts they're already facing directly against the state. Cool. On the idea of like corporize, and their response to our case was, okay, corporations will villainize you in status quo anyway. Note, and what is the comparative, right? Because on our side of the house, A, you make it significantly difficult for them in status quo to villainize you if you're someone who's peacefully protesting. It makes it significantly easier if you're someone who can be easily labeled as a terrorist. Note, the public response to these kinds of things, people get mad if you try to persecute someone who is like innocent and peaceful. People don't get mad when you try to persecute someone who can easily be labeled as a fucking terrorist. Cool. Coming to then opening government. Why we went out against them. I think firstly, they're really screwed up in like their first 2 minutes of their speech when they're trying to tell you that this will not, like, you know, they are unclear as to how frequently these, you know, violent attacks will happen, because they say, oh, you will be afraid of backlash, so you'll kind of do it in a restrictive way. Note, because Lachlan mechanized you that the state has an incentive and like a principled obligation to like protect like against any form of violence and like have some kind of peace within society. Insofar as that is a state obligation, the state will always respond to your violence with some form of backlash likely to be violent, which not only means that like, A, you're probably not going to do this quite a bit, hence like dulling their impacts, or B, you just have less of an ability to do it the second time or the third time because you're actually evading state pressure simultaneous to the fact that you actually have to conduct out these more difficult and resourceful tasks. Cool. Coming to then their idea of buy-in and support, because at POI, this note, they tell you will have shock value, media attention, and government pressure, but they give you zero likelihood analysis on why these reactions and this kind of like engagement is going to be positive in nature. A, on the idea of the state's primary obligation is to protect peace and security within the country. Insofar as you're taking a violent action, even if it is for like something that might be morally right, the state's obligation is to first stop your violence and then think about what you did, whether it was right or wrong. And insofar as that's the state's obligation, they're never going to support your movement if you're the one causing violence. Talking about media, note, the media, as Lachlan said, cares about sensationalizing stuff more than they care about, like, you know, if you're right or wrong, specifically if you conduct a violent act. So the like media coverage is likely going to be negative. You're not going to see like even Fox News or like CNN or even almost like any media being like openly celebrating acts of violence. Insofar as that is the case, you're actually going to get negative support, negative buy-in, and their idea of like weird mech about how like you're going to get more support because people now actually trust the movement to do something. No, if you're even part of the village that was destroyed by a factory dumping like, you know, water into the dumping waste into the water, sure, but you were also probably the village that was being employed by this factory. So you blew up the factory, and cool, how do you get people to support you more and give you money if you're like already the victim in this situation, or if your life has directly been impacted by this movement through the violence? I'll take OG.
Even if you are right and we're taking you at your best, these harms may happen sometimes. We weigh our harms, firstly, on irreversibility, not the example on cancer, but secondly, on low cost. We don't have to do this all the time. We can do it once to deter other corporations. Engage with our reasons, please.
I'm getting to that way. Note, if you do it even like 4 or 5 times in a year, like across the world, what happens is your movement gets associated with violence. And Lachlan already mechanized to you why with the minute your movement gets associated with violence, you automatically have less of an ability to actually explore other options of advocacy. Because no one in fucking Yale wants to sit down with someone who can be branded a terrorist and talk about like not investing their entire like endowment fund into oil companies. Right. So you need to explain why violence becomes the only and best way to pursue action, because we tell you prevent all other forms of action. But no,